The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Fallujah as Marine Sergeant Marcus Thompson adjusted his helmet and checked his rifle for the third time that morning. The city had become a maze of danger, where every corner could hide an enemy and every building might contain a sniper's nest. It was April 2004, and the Second Battle of Fallujah was raging with an intensity that would be remembered for decades. Marcus had been in Iraq for 8 months now, leading his squad through countless patrols and missions. At 26 years old, he was considered a veteran by the younger Marines under his command. His weathered face told stories of sleepless nights and close calls, but his eyes still held the determination that had driven him to volunteer for this deployment. Back home in Texas, his wife Sarah was raising their 2 young children, counting the days until his return. The mission that morning seemed routine enough. Intelligence reports indicated that insurgents were using a cluster of buildings in the eastern sector of the city as a weapons cache and meeting point. Marcus's squad was tasked with conducting a search and clear operation alongside 2 other Marine units. The plan was straightforward: move in quickly, secure the area, gather intelligence, and neutralize any threats they encountered. As they moved through the narrow alleyways, Marcus could feel the weight of his gear and the tension in the air. His squad consisted of 8 Marines, each one handpicked for their skills and reliability. There was Rodriguez, the squad's machine gunner, whose steady hands had saved them more times than anyone could count. Jenkins, barely 19, but with the sharpest eyes for spotting trouble. Williams, the medic whose calm demeanor under fire had earned him the respect of every man in the unit. The radio crackled with updates from the other squads as they approached their target buildings. Everything seemed to be going according to plan until they reached the main objective. The building stood 3 stories tall, its concrete walls scarred by previous battles. Windows had been boarded up or blown out entirely, creating dark openings that could conceal any number of threats. Marcus signaled for his team to take positions around the building while he and 2 others prepared to breach the main entrance. The street was eerily quiet, too quiet for comfort. Even the usual sounds of distant gunfire and helicopter rotors seemed muted. It was as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As they approached the entrance, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh footprints in the dust led away from the building, but they were too recent, too clean. Someone had been here within the last few minutes, possibly watching their approach. He raised his hand to signal a halt, but it was already too late. The first shots came from a rooftop across the street, muzzle flashes barely visible in the shadows. Marcus dove for cover behind a concrete barrier as bullets whined overhead and sparked off the pavement around him. The carefully planned operation had turned into a deadly ambush in the span of seconds. Rodriguez immediately returned fire with his machine gun, the heavy weapon chattering as he laid down suppressing fire on the suspected sniper positions. The other Marines scrambled for whatever cover they could find in the exposed street. Marcus could hear his radio operator calling for backup and air support, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. But the attack was just beginning. More muzzle flashes appeared from windows in surrounding buildings, and Marcus realized they had walked into a carefully orchestrated trap. The insurgents had been waiting for them, probably watching their movements for hours. Every building around them seemed to come alive with enemy fire, creating a deadly crossfire that left his squad pinned down with limited options for escape. Marcus made a split-second decision that would define the rest of the engagement. Instead of trying to retreat to safety, he chose to push forward toward their original objective. The building they had come to search might provide better cover and a tactical advantage if they could reach it. More importantly, he refused to leave any of his Marines behind, and moving forward was the only way to keep his squad together. Fighting his way from cover to cover, Marcus led his team in a desperate advance toward the target building. Bullets cracked past his head as he sprinted across open ground, his heart pounding not from fear, but from the determination to get his men to safety. Each step felt like a lifetime as concrete chips and dust filled the air around him. The squad's medic, Williams, was hit in the shoulder as they made their advance, but he kept moving, refusing to slow down the team. Jenkins provided covering fire while Rodriguez continued to hammer the enemy positions with his machine gun. The coordination and trust between these Marines was the product of months of training and combat experience, and it was the only thing keeping them alive in this deadly situation. As they finally reached the entrance to the target building, Marcus could see that the structure was larger and more complex than their intelligence had indicated. Multiple levels, numerous rooms, and what appeared to be a basement level that hadn't been mentioned in their briefing. This building wasn't just a weapons cache, it was a fortress that the insurgents had been preparing for exactly this kind of assault. Marcus knew that entering the building would be dangerous, but staying in the street meant certain death for his entire squad. The enemy fire was intensifying, and he could hear the distinct sound of more insurgents moving into position around them. They had minutes, maybe less, before they would be completely surrounded with no hope of escape. Looking back at his men, Marcus saw the same determination in their eyes that he felt in his own heart. These Marines had followed him through 8 months of combat, and they trusted him to make the right decisions even in the most impossible situations. As he prepared to lead them into the building, Marcus had no way of knowing that the next few minutes would test that trust in ways he could never have imagined. The sound of his radio crackled with urgent messages from command, but Marcus was focused entirely on the immediate threat. He gave the signal to move, and his squad prepared to enter what would become their battleground for the next several hours. None of them could have predicted that this routine mission would turn into one of the most harrowing survival stories of the entire Iraq War. The heavy wooden door splintered under the force of Marcus's boot as the squad stormed into the building. The interior was darker than expected, with only thin beams of sunlight filtering through the boarded windows. The air was thick with dust, and the acrid smell of gunpowder from the firefight outside. Every shadow could hide an enemy, and every corner presented a potential death trap. Marcus moved with practiced precision, his rifle raised and ready as he swept the first room. Behind him, his Marines spread out in a well-rehearsed formation that had been drilled into them through countless training exercises. The building's layout was more complex than their intelligence had suggested, with narrow hallways branching off in multiple directions and stairs leading to both upper and lower levels. The silence inside was deafening compared to the chaos in the streets. Marcus could still hear sporadic gunfire outside, but it seemed distant and muffled through the thick concrete walls. He knew that other Marine units were engaged in their own battles throughout the city, but for now, his squad was on their own in this urban fortress. Rodriguez took point on the machine gun, his heavy weapon ready to unleash devastating firepower if they encountered resistance. Jenkins moved to secure their rear, his sharp eyes constantly scanning for any sign of movement. Williams, despite his wounded shoulder, maintained his position as the squad's medic and secondary rifleman. The remaining Marines spread out to cover the various angles and approaches within the building. As they advanced deeper into the structure, Marcus began to understand why the insurgents had chosen this location. The building was like a maze, with rooms connected by narrow passages and multiple levels that provided excellent defensive positions. Whoever had planned the ambush outside had clearly spent considerable time preparing this building as a fallback position. The first floor appeared to be clear, but Marcus knew better than to assume they were safe. His experience in urban combat had taught him that enemies could be hiding anywhere, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The squad moved methodically, checking every room and clearing every corner with the same attention to detail that had kept them alive through months of combat operations. When they reached the staircase leading to the second floor, Marcus paused to reassess their situation. The gunfire outside had decreased significantly, which could mean either that the other Marine units had gained control of the situation or that the insurgents were repositioning for another attack. Either way, his squad needed to secure this building and establish a defensive position before more enemies arrived. The second floor revealed the true nature of their predicament. The rooms were filled with weapons caches, ammunition supplies, and communication equipment that confirmed this was a major insurgent stronghold. Maps and documents scattered across. Tables showed detailed plans for attacks throughout Fallujah. This wasn't just a random ambush, it was part of a larger, coordinated operation against coalition forces. Marcus quickly gathered some of the intelligence materials while his Marines continued to secure the floor. The information they had discovered could be crucial for preventing future attacks and saving American lives. But as he stuffed the documents into his pack, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze. Footsteps on the stairs below them. The insurgents had entered the building. Marcus immediately signaled for his squad to take defensive positions. The layout of the second floor gave them some advantages, with multiple rooms providing cover and overlapping fields of fire, but they were also trapped, with only one staircase providing access to their level and no obvious escape routes if the situation deteriorated. The sound of voices speaking in Arabic drifted up from the lower level, along with the metallic clicks of weapons being prepared for combat. Marcus estimated at least 6 to 8 insurgents had entered the building, though there could be more waiting outside. His squad was outnumbered, low on ammunition after the street fight, and had a wounded man who needed medical attention. Rodriguez positioned his machine gun to cover the staircase, while the other Marines spread out to defensive positions around the floor. Marcus knew that their survival depended on preventing the insurgents from reaching their level, but he also understood that this could turn into a prolonged siege if they couldn't find a way to break out. The first insurgent appeared at the top of the stairs just as Rodriguez opened fire. The heavy machine gun rounds tore through the concrete walls and sent chunks of debris flying in all directions. The enemy fighter was thrown backward down the stairs, but Marcus could hear more voices shouting below, coordinating their next attempt. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse that lasted for nearly an hour. The insurgents would attempt to rush the stairs, only to be driven back by devastating fire from the Marines. But each repelled attack cost ammunition that Marcus's squad couldn't afford to lose. Their supplies were running dangerously low, and the insurgents seemed to have an endless supply of fighters willing to test their defenses. Williams, despite his wounded shoulder, had taken up a position covering one of the windows overlooking the street. His reports indicated that more insurgents were gathering outside, effectively surrounding the building. The initial ambush had been just the beginning of what was clearly a major operation designed to eliminate the entire Marine patrol. Marcus tried repeatedly to establish radio contact with command, but the thick concrete walls and enemy jamming equipment were interfering with communications. Occasional broken transmissions suggested that other Marine units were engaged in heavy fighting throughout the sector, which meant that immediate backup was unlikely. His squad would have to hold their position and fight their way out with whatever resources they had remaining. The situation became critical when Jenkins spotted insurgents moving onto the roof of an adjacent building. From that position, they would have a clear line of sight into the windows of the second floor, effectively eliminating the Marines' defensive advantage. Marcus realized they had perhaps minutes before their position became completely untenable. Making another split-second decision that would determine their fate, Marcus decided to take the fight to the insurgents rather than wait to be overwhelmed. The plan was desperate and dangerous, but it was their only chance to break out of the trap that was slowly closing around them. He gathered his remaining Marines and prepared to execute one of the most audacious tactical maneuvers of his military career. As bullets began to shatter the windows around them, Marcus knew that the next few minutes would determine whether his squad lived or died in this concrete tomb. The insurgents were closing in from multiple directions, ammunition was running low, and time was running out. But Marcus Thompson was not ready to surrender, and neither were the Marines who had followed him into this hell. Marcus gathered his Marines in the center room of the second floor, away from the windows where sniper fire was becoming increasingly accurate. The sound of bullets striking concrete had become a constant percussion that mixed with the shouts of insurgents coordinating their assault from multiple positions. Time was running out, and Marcus knew that waiting any longer would mean certain death for his entire squad. The plan he outlined was simple in concept, but incredibly dangerous in execution. Rather than trying to defend their current position until they were overrun, the squad would launch a coordinated assault on the insurgents below, while simultaneously fighting their way to the roof. From there, they could signal for extraction and establish a more defensible position until help arrived. Rodriguez would provide covering fire with his machine gun while the rest of the squad moved in 2 teams. Marcus would lead the first team down the stairs to engage the insurgents on the ground floor, while Jenkins would take the second team up to secure the roof access. The success of the operation depended on perfect timing and the element of surprise. Williams, despite his wounded shoulder, insisted on joining the assault rather than staying behind. His medical skills might be needed if other Marines were wounded, and every rifle counted in their desperate situation. Marcus could see the determination in the medic's eyes, the same unwavering commitment that had defined this squad throughout their deployment. As they prepared to move, Marcus took a moment to look at each of his Marines. These men had become more than soldiers under his command. They were brothers who had shared the hardships and dangers of combat for months. Rodriguez, whose steady hands had saved them countless times. Jenkins, whose youth was tempered by an old soul and incredible courage. Williams, whose healing hands had brought wounded Marines back from the edge of death. The assault began with Rodriguez unleashing a devastating barrage of machine gun fire down the staircase. The heavy rounds punched through walls and sent concrete fragments flying like shrapnel, forcing the insurgents to take cover and disrupting their planned assault. In that brief window of chaos, Marcus led his team down the stairs with a ferocity that caught the enemy completely off guard. The ground floor erupted into close quarters, combat as Marines and insurgents fought room in a deadly dance of survival. Marcus's rifle barked repeatedly as he engaged targets at point-blank range, his training and experience guiding his movements through the smoke and confusion. The sounds of combat were deafening in the confined space, with weapons fire echoing off concrete walls and mixing with the shouts of men fighting for their lives. Meanwhile, Jenkins's team had successfully reached the roof, but they discovered that insurgents had already positioned themselves on nearby buildings with clear lines of sight to their position. The roof, which was supposed to provide a tactical advantage, had become another killing field where every movement drew immediate enemy fire. Marcus found himself separated from his team during the ground floor assault, when a grenade explosion brought down part of a wall, creating a barrier of rubble between him and the other Marines. Through the dust and debris, he could hear Williams calling for him. But the sounds of continued fighting indicated that his squad was still engaged with multiple enemies throughout the building. Fighting alone now, Marcus pressed deeper into the building, driven by the need to eliminate the insurgent threat and reunite with his Marines. His ammunition was running dangerously low, forcing him to make every shot count as he moved through rooms filled with smoke and shadows. The layout of the building worked against him, with narrow hallways and hidden alcoves providing perfect ambush positions for his enemies. It was in one of these narrow passages that Marcus encountered the insurgent leader, a man whose tactical knowledge and preparation had orchestrated the entire ambush. The two warriors faced each other in a hallway barely wide enough for one person, their weapons trained on each other in a standoff that could only end with one man walking away. The firefight that followed was brief but intense. Marcus's training and experience gave him the edge he needed, but not before the insurgent leader managed to activate a radio device that Marcus recognized as a detonator signal. Somewhere in the building, explosives had been placed as a final trap for any coalition forces who might penetrate their stronghold. The first explosion shook the entire structure, sending dust and debris cascading from the ceiling. Marcus realized that the insurgents had been prepared to destroy the building rather than let it fall into American hands. More explosions followed, each one weakening the structural integrity of their concrete fortress and threatening to bring the entire building down on top of them. Fighting his way back toward his squad, Marcus encountered Rodriguez, who had been forced to abandon his machine gun position when part of the ceiling collapsed. The big Marine was bleeding from multiple shrapnel wounds but was still mobile and determined to reach the rest of their team. Together, they fought through smoke-filled corridors as the building continued to shake from internal explosions. They found Williams on the second floor, providing medical aid to Jenkins, who had been wounded during the rooftop assault. The young Marine had taken a bullet to the leg but was conscious and alert, though he would need immediate evacuation once they escaped the collapsing building. The squad was battered and bloodied, but they were alive and still fighting. As another explosion rocked the building, Marcus made the decision that would define the rest of their ordeal. Rather than trying to escape through the main entrance, which was certainly monitored by insurgents, they would blast their way through an exterior wall and fight their way to a more defensible position. It was a desperate plan, but desperation had become their constant companion in this urban battlefield. Rodriguez still had several grenades remaining, and Marcus knew that properly placed explosives could create an exit route through the concrete wall. But the explosion would also alert every insurgent in the area to their location, turning their escape into a running battle through the streets of Fallujah. With Jenkins wounded and ammunition running low, Marcus wondered if his squad had the strength to survive what was coming next. As he prepared the charges that would either save them or seal their fate, Marcus could hear the voices of more insurgents gathering outside the building. The enemy knew they were trapped and wounded, and they were preparing for a final assault that would end the American resistance once and for all. The next few minutes would determine whether Sergeant Marcus Thompson and his Marines lived to see another day, or whether they would make their final stand in the rubble of a building that had become their tomb. The explosion that blew out the exterior wall was followed immediately by a hail of gunfire from insurgents who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Marcus had anticipated the response, but the intensity of the enemy fire was beyond what he had expected. The hole in the wall was large enough for his squad to escape through, but reaching it would require crossing 20 feet of open floor while under direct fire from multiple positions. Marcus went first, sprinting across the exposed space as bullets whined past his head and sparked off the concrete around him. He could hear his Marines providing covering fire from behind, their remaining ammunition being expended in desperate bursts to keep the insurgents from achieving clean shots. Rodriguez's voice boomed above the gunfire as he coordinated their movements with the precision that had kept them alive through countless battles. Williams followed next, half-carrying Jenkins, whose wounded leg made running nearly impossible. The medic's own shoulder wound reopened under the strain, leaving a trail of blood on the dusty floor, but his determination to save his fellow Marine never wavered. Marcus reached through the hole in the wall to help pull them to safety, as enemy bullets continued to tear chunks out of the concrete around them. Rodriguez came last, laying down suppressing fire until the final moment, before diving through the opening just as insurgent fighters appeared in the doorway behind him. A grenade exploded in the room they had just vacated, filling the air with smoke and debris. The blast was so close that Marcus felt the heat wash over him, and his ears rang from the concussion. They had escaped the building, but their situation had not improved. The alley they found themselves in was narrow and offered little cover, while insurgents were already moving to surround their new position. The sound of running feet and shouting voices came from multiple directions as the enemy coordinated their response to the American breakout. Marcus quickly assessed their tactical situation. Jenkins needed immediate medical attention for his leg wound, and both Williams and Rodriguez were bleeding from multiple injuries sustained during the building assault. Their ammunition was critically low, with most Marines down to their last magazine. Radio communication was still impossible due to enemy jamming, which meant no immediate hope of rescue or support. The decision to move came when Marcus spotted insurgents setting up a machine gun position at the far end of the alley. In less than a minute, that weapon would have them pinned down with no escape route. He made the call to advance toward the enemy position, rather than retreat, knowing that aggressive action was their only chance to break free from the trap that was closing around them. What followed was a running battle through the narrow streets and alleyways of Fallujah that would test every skill Marcus and his Marines had learned in their months of urban combat. They moved from cover to cover, fighting off attacks from multiple directions while trying to reach a more defensible position. Each intersection presented a new threat, and each building could hide snipers or ambush teams waiting to finish them off. It was during this desperate fighting retreat that Marcus was hit by the first bullet. The round struck him in the left shoulder, spinning him around and nearly knocking him to the ground. The impact felt like being hit with a sledgehammer, but adrenaline and determination kept him moving. He could hear Williams calling out that he was wounded, but there was no time to stop for medical treatment while they were still under active fire. The second bullet caught him in the thigh as they crossed an open courtyard, the round tearing through muscle and sending him stumbling into Rodriguez's strong arms. The big Marine steadied him and helped him continue moving, even as their situation became increasingly desperate. Blood was flowing freely from both wounds, leaving a trail that their enemies could follow even if they managed to break contact. Marcus refused to slow down the squad despite his injuries. He knew that stopping meant death for all of them, and he would rather die fighting than see his Marines captured or killed because of his wounds. The pain was becoming a constant companion, but he pushed it aside and focused on the tactical situation that was evolving around them. The third and fourth bullets hit almost simultaneously as they fought their way through a marketplace that had been turned into a battlefield. One round struck Marcus in the back, just below his body armor, while another grazed his right arm. The impact sent him to his knees, but Williams was there immediately, helping him back to his feet while returning fire at the insurgents who were pressing their attack from multiple directions. Rodriguez had taken command of the tactical situation, his experience and leadership keeping the squad moving, even as their sergeant was becoming increasingly weakened by blood loss. The machine gunner's calm voice provided direction and coordination that held the team together when everything else was falling apart. His weapon had long since run out of ammunition, forcing him to rely on his rifle for the continuing firefight. Jenkins, despite his own leg wound, had become Marcus's primary support, helping him move from position to position while maintaining his own combat effectiveness. The young Marine's courage under fire was remarkable, especially considering that this was only his second deployment and his first major urban battle. His sharp eyes continued to spot threats and opportunities that kept the squad ahead of their pursuers. As they fought their way deeper into the city, Marcus began to realize that their situation was deteriorating faster than he had anticipated. His wounds were sapping his strength, and the blood loss was making it difficult to think clearly. More importantly, he could see that his condition was affecting the entire squad's ability to move and fight effectively. They were being slowed down by his injuries, making them easier targets for the insurgents who continued to pursue them. The 5th, 6th, and 7th bullets found their mark as the squad attempted to cross another open area. Marcus felt each impact as a separate explosion of pain, but the shock was beginning to dull his awareness of individual wounds. His body was going into survival mode, shutting down non-essential functions to preserve his life, but he could feel his combat effectiveness disappearing with each passing minute. Williams was constantly at his side now, applying pressure bandages and administering what medical care was possible while they continued to move under fire. The medic's own wounds were being ignored as he focused entirely on keeping his sergeant alive and mobile. His medical training was being put to the ultimate test in conditions that no field manual had ever described. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the battle-torn city, Marcus realized that they were not going to be able to continue their fighting retreat much longer. His Marines were exhausted, wounded, and nearly out of ammunition. The insurgents seemed to have unlimited resources and reinforcements, while his squad was operating on pure determination and dwindling supplies. It was then that Marcus made the decision that would define the final phase of their ordeal. Rather than continuing to run and fight a losing battle through the streets, he would find a defensive position where his Marines could make a stand. If they were going to die in Fallujah, they would do it on their own terms, fighting to the last round and the last breath. The building he chose for their final stand was a partially destroyed mosque that offered good fields of fire and multiple defensive positions. The partially destroyed mosque that Marcus had chosen for their final stand had been damaged in earlier fighting, leaving gaping holes in its walls that provided both firing positions and vulnerabilities. The building's elevated position gave them a tactical advantage over the surrounding streets, but it also made them visible to insurgents approaching from multiple directions. As his Marines took defensive positions, Marcus knew they had perhaps an hour of daylight remaining before darkness would change the nature of their battle entirely. Williams immediately set up a makeshift aid station in the mosque's main prayer hall, using whatever medical supplies remained to treat the squad's accumulated wounds. Marcus had been hit 7 times now with bullets in his shoulder, thigh, back, and arm, along with multiple grazing wounds that continued to bleed steadily. The medic worked with practiced efficiency, but his own wounded shoulder limited his range of motion and made treating Marcus increasingly difficult. Rodriguez positioned himself at the main entrance with his rifle, having long since exhausted the ammunition for his machine gun. His multiple shrapnel wounds had been roughly bandaged, but blood continued to seep through the field dressings. Despite his injuries, the big Marine maintained his post with unwavering determination, his eyes constantly scanning the approaches to their position for signs of enemy movement. Jenkins had taken up a sniper position in the mosque's damaged minaret, his wounded leg propped up to provide stability for long-range shots. From his elevated position, he could see insurgents gathering in buildings throughout the surrounding area, preparing for what appeared to be a coordinated assault on their defensive position. His reports to Marcus painted a grim picture of overwhelming enemy forces converging on their location. As the insurgents began their assault, Marcus realized that this battle would be different from their previous encounters. The enemy was no longer trying to capture them alive or preserve the building. They were committed to destroying the American position regardless of the cost. Heavy weapons that had been held in reserve were now being brought forward, including rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine guns that could devastate their defensive positions. The first RPG round struck the mosque's eastern wall, sending chunks of ancient stone flying through the air and filling the prayer hall with choking dust. Marcus felt the concussion of the explosion wash over him, adding to the disorientation caused by blood loss and fatigue. Through the ringing in his ears, he could hear Rodriguez calling out target information as insurgents began their ground assault. Marcus tried to take up a firing position at one of the windows, but his wounds were making it increasingly difficult to maintain steady aim. The 8th bullet had found him during the initial exchange of fire, striking his left side and causing intense pain with every breath. Williams appeared at his side immediately, helping to reposition him and applying another pressure bandage to the fresh wound. The battle for the mosque intensified as more insurgents joined the assault. Marcus could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles mixing with the heavier reports of his Marines' M4 carbines. Jenkins's rifle spoke occasionally from the minaret, each shot carefully aimed at high-value targets who were directing the enemy assault. Rodriguez maintained a steady rate of fire from the main entrance, his years of combat experience evident in his target selection and ammunition conservation. It was during the second wave of the assault that Marcus took 3 more hits in rapid succession. The 9th, 10th, and 11th bullets struck him as he attempted to move between firing positions, each impact adding to the growing weakness that was threatening to overwhelm his ability to function. Williams was becoming increasingly concerned about his sergeant's condition, but the ongoing battle prevented him from providing the intensive medical care that Marcus desperately needed. The insurgents had brought up a heavy machine gun that was systematically destroying their defensive positions. The weapon's heavy rounds punched through the mosque's stone walls as if they were paper, forcing the Marines to constantly shift positions to avoid being pinned down. Marcus realized that their ammunition was running critically low, with most of his Marines down to their final magazine. As darkness began to fall over Fallujah, the nature of the battle changed dramatically. The insurgents launched a series of coordinated attacks that tested every aspect of the Marines' defensive preparations. Marcus could hear enemy fighters moving through the ruins around the mosque, using the cover of darkness to get closer to their positions. The sound of grenades exploding and automatic weapons fire created a constant din that made communication between his Marines increasingly difficult. The 12th bullet found Marcus as he attempted to help Rodriguez repel a particularly determined assault on the main entrance. The round struck him in the chest, just below his body armor, and the impact knocked him to his knees. Williams was there immediately, his hands working frantically to assess the damage and apply whatever treatment was possible under the circumstances. The medic's face was grim as he worked, and Marcus could see the concern in his eyes. Jenkins continued to provide sniper support from the minaret, but his ammunition was nearly exhausted, and his wounded leg was making it difficult to maintain his firing position. His reports indicated that more insurgents were arriving constantly, turning their defensive stand into a siege that could only end one way. The young Marine's voice remained steady over the radio, but Marcus could hear the strain of prolonged combat beginning to affect even his remarkable composure. Rodriguez had been forced to fall back from the main entrance when the heavy machine gun fire became too intense. The big Marine was bleeding from several new wounds, but he continued to fight with the same determination that had defined his entire military career. His rifle was running low on ammunition, forcing him to make every shot count as the insurgents pressed their assault from multiple directions. The 13th bullet struck Marcus in the leg as he attempted to move to a new firing position. The impact sent him sprawling across the prayer hall floor, his rifle clattering away into the darkness. Williams crawled over to him immediately, dragging his medical bag and working to stop the bleeding from yet another wound. The medic's supplies were nearly exhausted, and he was being forced to improvise treatment using whatever materials he could find. As the battle entered its most critical phase, Marcus realized that his Marines were running out of time and ammunition. The insurgents had succeeded in surrounding the mosque and were preparing for a final assault that would overwhelm their defensive positions. His radio was still jammed, preventing any communication with other Marine units that might be able to provide support. They were alone, wounded, and nearly out of ammunition, facing an enemy that seemed determined to fight to the death. It was then that Marcus heard a sound that gave him the first hope he had felt in hours. Above the noise of battle, he could hear the distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors approaching their position. The sound was faint but unmistakable, and it meant that somewhere in the chaos of Fallujah, other American forces were still fighting and might be coming to their aid. As the 14th bullet found its mark in his shoulder, Marcus held on to that sound like a lifeline, knowing that his Marine's survival might depend on whoever was flying through the darkness toward their desperate battle. The helicopter sound grew louder as it approached the mosque, but Marcus knew that even if it was a rescue mission, the aircraft would face the same deadly reception that had trapped his squad. The insurgents had prepared for exactly this possibility, positioning anti-aircraft weapons and RPG teams to target any American aircraft that attempted to reach the besieged Marines. Through the haze of pain and blood loss, Marcus could hear Jenkins calling out warnings about enemy fighters moving into position with shoulder-fired missiles. Williams had exhausted his medical supplies and was now using torn pieces of cloth from his uniform to bandage Marcus's wounds. The 14th bullet had struck his shoulder at an angle that suggested the insurgents were firing from elevated positions, probably from the rooftops of surrounding buildings. The medic's hands were steady despite his own wounds, but Marcus could see the desperation in his eyes as he worked to keep his sergeant alive. Rodriguez had found a defensive position that allowed him to cover multiple approaches to the mosque, but his ammunition was down to less than half a magazine. The big Marine's face was streaked with blood and dust, and his movements showed the strain of hours of continuous combat. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse from breathing smoke and shouting commands over the noise of battle. The helicopter sound suddenly intensified, and through the gaps in the mosque's damaged walls, Marcus could see the distinctive outline of two Blackhawks approaching at low altitude. But his moment of hope was shattered when he heard the unmistakable whoosh of RPG rounds being fired at the aircraft. One of the helicopters banked sharply to avoid the incoming missiles, while the other began taking heavy small arms fire from multiple positions around the mosque. Jenkins's voice crackled over the radio from his position in the minaret. Despite his wounded leg and exhausted condition, the young Marine had spotted the SEALs fast roping from the helicopters onto buildings several blocks away. The elite Special Operations Forces had come for them, but they would have to fight their way through the same gauntlet of insurgents that had trapped Marcus's squad for the past several hours. Marcus tried to sit up to assess the situation, but his body refused to respond properly. 14 bullet wounds had taken their toll, and massive blood loss was causing his vision to blur and his thoughts to become confused. Williams appeared at his side again, checking his pulse and speaking in urgent tones that Marcus could barely understand. The medic's face showed the strain of trying to keep his sergeant alive under impossible conditions. The sound of explosions grew closer as the SEALs fought their way toward the mosque. Marcus could hear the distinctive reports of their advanced weapons mixing with the insurgents' AK-47 fire. Grenades exploded in a rolling thunder that shook the ancient building's foundations, and the sharp crack of sniper rifles indicated that the rescue force was systematically eliminating the enemy positions that had kept his squad pinned down. Rodriguez managed to establish radio contact with the approaching SEALs, his voice steady despite his wounds as he provided tactical information about the insurgent positions around the mosque. The big Marine's experience and knowledge of the local area were crucial for helping the rescue team navigate through the maze of enemy fighters. His reports were precise and professional, even as bullets continued to strike the walls around his position. The battle reached its climax when the SEALs launched a coordinated assault on the buildings surrounding the mosque. Marcus could hear the sound of breaching charges exploding as the elite operators systematically cleared each insurgent position. The intensity of gunfire increased dramatically as the two American forces caught the insurgents in a deadly crossfire that began to turn the tide of the battle. Jenkins provided overwatch from the minaret, using his last few rounds to eliminate insurgent fighters who were attempting to escape or reposition to attack the SEALs. Despite his wounded leg and exhausted condition, the young Marine's marksmanship remained precise, each shot carefully aimed to support the rescue operation. His position in the damaged tower gave him a clear view of the entire battlefield. Williams never left Marcus's side during the final phase of the battle, constantly monitoring his vital signs and providing whatever medical care was possible with their exhausted supplies. The medic had fashioned a makeshift IV using equipment salvaged from his aid bag, desperately trying to replace some of the blood that Marcus had lost during the prolonged firefight. His own shoulder wound had reopened completely, but he ignored his pain to focus on his sergeant's critical condition. The first SEAL appeared at the mosque entrance just as the sun was beginning to rise over Fallujah. The operator moved with practiced efficiency, his advanced equipment and training evident in every movement. Behind him came a Navy corpsman, whose medical supplies and expertise offered hope for Marcus's survival. The sight of these elite warriors entering their defensive position felt like a miracle to the exhausted Marines. Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness as the SEALs secured the mosque and began preparing for evacuation. He could hear voices discussing his condition in medical terms that suggested his wounds were life-threatening. The Navy corpsman worked alongside Williams to stabilize him for transport. Their combined efforts focused on keeping him alive long enough to reach proper medical facilities, though evacuation itself was a blur of movement and pain as Marcus was loaded onto a stretcher and carried to the helicopter landing zone that the SEALs had secured. Rodriguez, Jenkins, and Williams stayed close to their sergeant, refusing to be separated even as their own wounds required immediate attention. The bonds forged through months of combat and this desperate last stand were stronger than any medical protocol. As the Black Hawk lifted off from Fallujah with its cargo of wounded Marines, Marcus caught a glimpse of the city that had nearly claimed their lives. The mosque where they had made their stand was still smoking from the battle, surrounded by the bodies of insurgents who had paid the ultimate price for their ambush. His Marines had survived against impossible odds, their courage and determination carrying them through the darkest hours of their military careers. The flight to the field hospital was a race against time as Marcus's condition continued to deteriorate. The Navy corpsman worked frantically to maintain his vital signs while Williams provided crucial information about the wounds and treatment that had been administered during the battle. Rodriguez and Jenkins, despite their own injuries, maintained a protective watch over their sergeant, their loyalty unshaken by the trauma they had endured. 2 days after the ambush in Fallujah, Marcus Thompson opened his eyes in a military hospital, alive but forever changed by his experience. 14 bullet wounds had nearly ended his life, but the courage of his Marines and the skill of the SEALs who had rescued them had given him another chance. The hero of Fallujah had survived, though the scars of that terrible day would remain with him and his squad for the rest of their lives. Their story would become legend among Marines, a testament to the bonds of brotherhood that can overcome even the most desperate circumstances in the crucible of combat.